The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Bucklebury Manor, casting gentle shadows across the kitchen where Carole Middleton stood motionless. Her hands gripped the edge of the granite countertop, knuckles white against the polished surface. The cup of tea she had made 20 minutes earlier sat untouched, steam no longer rising from its surface. Michael found her there when he came downstairs, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the sleepless hours she had endured. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her normally perfectly styled hair hung loose around her shoulders. "Carole," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You need to eat something before we go." She turned to face him, and he saw the fear she had been trying so hard to hide. "I keep thinking about when she was little," she whispered. "Remember when she fell off her bike and scraped her knee? She was so brave, didn't cry until she saw my face. Then, she knew it was safe to let the tears come." Michael pulled her into his arms, feeling the tension in her body. "She's still that brave little girl, just stronger now." The drive to London felt endless despite the early hour and light traffic. Carole stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar countryside give way to suburban neighborhoods and, finally, to the busy streets of the capital. Each mile brought them closer to the private hospital where Catherine was recovering, and, with each mile, Carole's anxiety grew. She had spoken to William the night before, his voice carefully controlled as he explained the successful surgery. The doctors were pleased with how everything had gone, he assured her. Catherine was resting comfortably. But Carole heard the exhaustion in her son-in-law's voice, the weight of worry he was carrying for his wife and young children. "The children don't fully understand," William had told her quietly. "George keeps asking when Mama will come home. Charlotte wants to draw her pictures, and Louis, he just wants his mama." Those words had broken something inside Carole. Her daughter, her firstborn child, lay in a hospital bed while her grandchildren struggled to understand why their mother couldn't be with them. The helplessness she felt was overwhelming. At the hospital, Michael squeezed her hand as they walked through the main entrance. The pristine floors and sterile smell brought back memories of other hospital visits over the years. When her own mother had been ill, when Michael's father had his heart attack, when each of her children had their various childhood injuries and illnesses. But this felt different. This was her Catherine, her baby girl who had grown into a remarkable woman, wife, and mother. The elevator ride to the private wing seemed to last forever. Carole watched the floor numbers light up one by one, her heart racing with each passing second. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would appear strong and supportive. Catherine didn't need to see her mother falling apart. William met them at the nurse's station, looking tired but managing a smile. He hugged them both, holding on to Carole a moment longer than usual. "She's been asking for you," he said simply. "She's awake but still groggy from the medication." As they walked down the corridor toward Catherine's room, Carole tried to steel herself. She would be the mother Catherine needed her to be. Strong, positive, reassuring. She would hold back her own fears and focus entirely on her daughter's needs. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight that greeted her when William opened the door. Catherine lay propped up in the hospital bed, pale against the white pillows. Various monitors beeped softly around her, and 4 drips stood sentinel beside the bed. Her usually vibrant hair was pulled back simply, and her face, though tired, lit up when she saw her parents. "Mum," Catherine said, her voice slightly hoarse but warm with affection. That single word shattered every defense Carole had carefully constructed. The sight of her daughter, so vulnerable yet trying to smile for her sake, broke through all the emotional barriers she had built. Years of worry, pride, love, and fierce protectiveness crashed over her like a wave. The tears came without warning, hot and unstoppable. They streamed down her cheeks as she stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move forward or speak. All she could see was her little girl, the same child who had once run to her with scraped knees and broken toys, now lying in a hospital bed after major surgery. "Oh, darling," Carole whispered, her voice breaking as she finally moved toward the bed. "My sweet girl." Catherine's own eyes filled with tears as she watched her mother's composure crumble. "Mum, it's okay. I'm okay. Please don't cry." But Carole couldn't stop. 24 hours of suppressed fear and anxiety poured out of her as she gently took Catherine's hand in both of hers. The hand felt smaller than she remembered, more fragile, and that realization brought fresh tears. "I was so scared," Carole admitted, her voice barely audible. "I know you're strong, I know you're brave, but you're still my baby." You'll always be my baby, no matter how grown up you are. Michael moved quietly to Carole's side, placing a steadying hand on her back while William discreetly stepped outside to give the family a private moment. The room filled with the sound of gentle crying from both mother and daughter, tears of relief mixing with tears of love. Catherine squeezed her mother's hand weakly. "I thought about you during the surgery," she said softly. "About how you always made everything better when I was little. How you could fix anything with a hug and a cup of tea." Carole laughed through her tears, remembering countless childhood incidents where that had indeed been her solution. "I wish I could fix this the same way." "You are," Catherine replied. "Just by being here. Just by loving me the way you always have." The next hour passed in quiet conversation and comfortable silences. Carole gradually regained her composure, wiping away the last of her tears and focusing on her daughter's needs. She helped Catherine sip some water, adjusted her pillows, and listened as Catherine spoke about the children and how much she missed them. "They wanted to come," Catherine explained. "George especially. He doesn't understand why he can't visit yet." "Soon enough," Carole assured her. "When you're feeling stronger, when the doctors say it's okay. They need to see you healing, not just lying here connected to machines." As the morning progressed, other family members began to arrive. Pippa came first, having driven up from her home in the countryside. Her usual composed demeanor cracked slightly when she saw Catherine, but she quickly recovered and brought news of the outside world, normal family gossip that helped lighten the mood. James arrived with flowers from his garden and stories about his business ventures that made Catherine smile. Seeing her children together, even in these circumstances, filled Carole with a deep sense of gratitude. Despite their different paths in life, they remained close, supporting each other through whatever challenges arose. The medical team made their rounds, checking Catherine's progress and adjusting her treatment plan. The doctors were pleased with her recovery so far, explaining that while the road ahead would require patience, the prognosis was excellent. Carole listened intently to every word, filing away information to research later, to better understand what Catherine would face in the coming weeks. As afternoon approached, it became clear that Catherine needed rest. The pain medication was making her drowsy, and the doctors emphasized the importance of sleep in the healing process. Reluctantly, the family began to prepare to leave, knowing they would return the next day. Carole was the last to say goodbye, lingering beside the bed as Catherine's eyes grew heavy. "I love you more than you'll ever know," she whispered, stroking her daughter's hair gently. "I love you too, Mom," Catherine replied sleepily. "Thank you for crying. It made me feel less alone." Those words stayed with Carole as she and Michael made their way back through the hospital corridors. Her tears hadn't been a sign of weakness, as she had feared. They had been a gift to her daughter, permission to feel vulnerable and scared, an acknowledgement that what Catherine was going through was significant and worthy of tears. Outside, the London afternoon was bright and bustling. People hurried past on their daily business, unaware that in the hospital behind them, a mother had just experienced one of the most emotionally intense moments of her life. Carole felt strangely lightened despite her exhaustion, as if the tears had washed away some of the fear she had been carrying. The drive home was quieter than the morning journey. Both Carole and Michael were lost in their own thoughts, processing the events of the day. The relief of seeing Catherine alert and recovering was tempered by the reality of the long healing process ahead. Back at Bucklebury, the house felt empty without the usual bustle of grandchildren's visits. Carole wandered through the rooms, touching objects that reminded her of Catherine's childhood. The piano where she had practiced for years, never quite mastering it but enjoying the process. The bookshelf filled with her favorite stories, many read aloud countless times during bedtime routines. That evening, as Carole finally ate her first real meal in over a day, she reflected on the morning's emotional breakdown. She had always prided herself on being strong for her children, on being the rock they could depend on. Seeing Catherine in that hospital bed had stripped away all pretense and reminded her that beneath all the royal protocol and public scrutiny, they were simply a mother and daughter who loved each other deeply. The phone rang as they were finishing dinner. It was William, calling with an update on Catherine's evening. She had eaten a little soup, he reported, and was asking about plans for the children to visit. Her spirits seemed better after seeing her family, and she had even managed to laugh at something James had said earlier. "Thank you for coming today," William said to Carole. "And thank you for being real with her. She needs that right now, needs to know it's okay to not be perfect all the time." After hanging up, Carole sat in her favorite chair by the fireplace, a cup of tea finally, steaming warm in her hands. The day had been emotionally exhausting, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes love required breaking down, required showing vulnerability, required tears that came from the deepest places of the heart. Tomorrow would bring another visit, another opportunity to support Catherine through this difficult time. There would be many days ahead filled with doctor's appointments, gradual recovery, and careful steps back toward normal life. But tonight, Carole allowed herself to feel the full weight of her love for her daughter, and the profound relief that came from knowing Catherine was going to be all right. The tears she had shed that morning hadn't been just about fear or worry. They had been about the overwhelming nature of maternal love, about the impossibility of protecting your children from all of life's challenges, and about the strength that comes from facing those challenges together. As she prepared for bed, Carole knew that tomorrow she would be ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful thing a mother can do is simply allow herself to be human. The second day dawned cloudy and cool, matching Carole's restless mood. She had slept fitfully, waking several times throughout the night with thoughts of Catherine alone in that sterile hospital room. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter's pale face against the white pillows, heard the soft beeping of the monitors that had become the soundtrack of their new reality. Michael was already awake when she stirred at dawn, sitting by the window with his morning coffee and the newspaper folded unopened beside him. They shared a quiet breakfast, both lost in their own thoughts about what the day might bring. The emotional release of yesterday had left them both feeling strangely vulnerable, as if a protective layer had been stripped away. "William texted early," Michael said, showing her his phone. "Catherine had a good night. She's asking for her mother again." Carole felt a flutter of warmth mixed with anxiety. Yesterday's visit had been cathartic but emotionally draining. She wondered if she would be able to maintain better control today, to be the steady presence Catherine needed without falling apart again. The journey to London seemed shorter this morning, perhaps because Carole knew what to expect. The familiar route through the countryside and into the city had become routine in just 2 days, though she suspected it would be many more days before this particular journey ended. At the hospital, the staff greeted them with the polite recognition of regular visitors. The nurses had clearly been briefed about the family's situation, offering warm smiles and gentle updates as they made their way to Catherine's wing. This small kindness meant more than they could know. William looked better this morning, having clearly managed some actual sleep. He embraced them both warmly, and Carole could see the relief in his eyes. "She's been awake for about an hour," he explained as they walked toward the room. "The doctors are pleased with her progress. They think she might be able to go home sooner than originally expected." Carole's heart leaped at this news. Home meant healing, meant normalcy gradually returning to their lives. But she also knew that going home would bring its own challenges, particularly with 3 young children eager to help their mother in ways that might not always be helpful for her recovery. When they entered Catherine's room, the change was immediately apparent. Though still pale and clearly recovering, Catherine was sitting up more comfortably. Her hair had been brushed and pulled back neatly, and she wore her own pajamas rather than the hospital gown from yesterday. These small signs of returning normalcy filled Carole with hope. "Good morning, darling," Carole said, leaning down to kiss Catherine's forehead gently. "You look so much better today." Catherine smiled, and Carole was relieved to see more genuine warmth in her eyes. "I feel a bit better. The pain is more manageable today, and I actually slept for a few hours straight last night." They settled into comfortable conversation about practical matters. Catherine wanted to know about arrangements being made for the children, about household management in her absence, about the various royal engagements that would need to be handled. Carole marveled at her daughter's ability to think of others even while recovering from surgery. "The children are fine," Carole assured her. "Pippa took them to the park yesterday afternoon, and James is planning to bring them some new books later this week. They're being very brave, but they miss you terribly." Catherine's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her children. "I hate that they have to go through this. George keeps asking questions I don't know how to answer. How do you explain surgery to a child without frightening them?" Carole remembered her own struggles with similar conversations when Catherine and her siblings were young. There had been the death of beloved family pets, the illness of grandparents, various family crises that required delicate explanation to young minds trying to make sense of an often confusing world. "You tell them the truth in simple words they can understand," Carole said. "That mama was sick, and the doctors fixed what was wrong, and now she needs time to get strong again. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel secure in their parents' love. The morning brought a steady stream of visitors. The medical team conducted their rounds, expressing satisfaction with Catherine's recovery progress. Various hospital administrators stopped by to ensure everything was being handled properly for their high-profile patient. Each interaction required Catherine to be on in a way that clearly drained her energy. Carole watched these exchanges with growing concern. Even in recovery, Catherine felt compelled to be gracious and accommodating to everyone around her. It was a habit so ingrained from years of public life that she seemed incapable of simply being a patient focused solely on her own healing. When they finally had some privacy, Carole addressed this directly. "Darling, you don't need to charm every person who walks through that door. You're allowed to just be sick right now." Catherine looked surprised by this permission. "But they're all being so kind, going out of their way to help. And they'll continue to be kind even if you're not performing for them," Carole replied firmly. "Your job right now is to get better. Nothing else matters." As the day progressed, Carole began to understand the complex dynamics of Catherine's situation. The private wing of the hospital offered protection from media and curious onlookers, but it also created a bubble where normal patient behavior seemed somehow inadequate. Catherine felt pressure to be the perfect patient just as she had always felt pressure to be the perfect princess, perfect wife, perfect mother. Lunch arrived on elegant china rather than standard hospital trays, another reminder of how even illness was different when you lived in the public eye. Catherine picked at her food, clearly struggling with appetite and nausea from the medications. Carole encouraged her to eat what she could, remembering countless childhood meals where similar patience had been required. "Tell me about home," Catherine said suddenly. "Tell me about normal things. What flowers are blooming in the garden? What are you reading? I need to hear about life continuing normally somewhere." So Carole talked about the spring flowers beginning to emerge in their garden, about the book club meeting she had missed to be here, about plans for Easter celebrations assuming Catherine would be home and recovering by then. These ordinary details seemed to soothe Catherine, connecting her to the normal rhythms of life beyond hospital walls. An afternoon nap was interrupted by a call from the school. George had become upset during class, crying about his mother and asking to come to the hospital. The headmistress was kind but clearly uncertain how to handle the situation involving such a high-profile family. Catherine's distress at this news was immediate and overwhelming. "I should be there," she said, struggling to sit up despite her pain. "He needs me, and I'm stuck here useless." "You're not useless," Carole said firmly, gently encouraging Catherine to lie back down. "You're recovering so you can be there for him for years to come. Sometimes the best thing a mother can do for her children is take care of herself." They decided that William would leave to handle the school situation, giving Catherine peace of mind that George was being properly cared for. But his departure left Catherine feeling even more disconnected from her normal life and responsibilities. "I keep thinking about all the ways I'm failing right now," Catherine admitted as afternoon sunlight slanted through the hospital windows. "As a mother, as a wife, as someone with public duties. Everyone is having to cover for me, clean up the mess of my being sick." Carole felt her heart break for her daughter's self-criticism. "Darling, getting sick isn't a personal failing. Having surgery isn't a character flaw. You're not letting anyone down by being human." But she could see that Catherine's perfectionist tendencies, so useful in her public role, had become a burden during recovery. The idea that she might appear weak or needy went against everything she had been trained to project. Even here, in a hospital bed, she was trying to be flawless. As evening approached, the hospital began to quiet down. The bustle of daytime procedures and visits gave way to the gentler rhythms of night shift care. Catherine finally seemed to relax slightly, perhaps feeling less pressure to be on as the day wound down. Pippa arrived with dinner from Catherine's favorite restaurant, something more appealing than the hospital food. She brought news from the outside world and pictures the children had drawn for their mother. These simple gestures seemed to revive Catherine's spirits more than any medical intervention. "Look what George made," Pippa said, showing a crayon drawing of a family with stick figures holding hands. "He insisted on drawing you extra tall because he says mamas are the biggest and strongest people in the world." Catherine laughed for the first time that day, a sound that filled Carole with relief. This was still her daughter, still the warm and loving person she had always been, just temporarily sidelined by medical necessity. As visiting hours drew to a close, the family began their reluctant preparations to leave. Catherine would face another night alone in the hospital, though the nurses assured everyone that she was progressing well enough that these nights were numbered. "Tomorrow will be better," Carole promised, kissing Catherine goodnight. "Each day will be a little better than the last." "I hope so," Catherine replied. "I'm tired of feeling so helpless." Walking back through the hospital corridors, Carole reflected on the emotional complexities of this experience. Yesterday's tears had been about fear and love. Today's challenges were about patience and acceptance, about allowing the healing process to unfold at its own pace rather than trying to control or accelerate it. The drive home was peaceful, with both Carole and Michael processing the day's events. They had seen encouraging signs of Catherine's physical recovery, but they had also witnessed her struggle with the emotional aspects of being dependent on others. This was perhaps the hardest part for someone who had spent her adult life taking care of others. At home, Carole found herself restless despite her exhaustion. She wandered through the house, straightening things that didn't need straightening, preparing for tomorrow's hospital visit. The normal evening routines felt strange when overshadowed by concern for Catherine. Before bed, William called with updates from his evening with the children. George had been comforted by his father's presence and explanations about his mother's recovery. Charlotte had made another drawing for tomorrow's visit. Louis, too young to fully understand the situation, was simply happy to have extra attention from his father. "She worries too much about being perfect even now," William said about Catherine. "I think seeing you cry yesterday helped her realize it's okay to not have everything together all the time." This observation stayed with Carole as she prepared for bed. Perhaps her emotional breakdown had served a purpose beyond simple release. Perhaps it had given Catherine permission to be vulnerable, to acknowledge that recovery was difficult and frightening sometimes. The next morning would bring another hospital visit, another day of careful optimism and patient support. But tonight, Carole felt more prepared for whatever emotions might arise. She had learned that tears were not always a sign of weakness, that perfect composure was not always what her daughter needed most. Sometimes the greatest gift a mother could give was the simple acknowledgement that love included fear, that caring deeply sometimes hurt, and that being human meant accepting both strength and vulnerability as necessary parts of the experience. Tomorrow she would carry these lessons with her as they continued this journey toward healing together. The third morning brought unexpected sunshine streaming through the windows of Bucklebury Manor, and, with it, a phone call that changed everything. Catherine would be discharged that afternoon, 2 days earlier than originally planned. Her recovery was progressing so well that the medical team felt she would be more comfortable continuing her healing at home. Carole felt a surge of joy mixed with new anxiety. Home meant safety and comfort, but it also meant she would become Catherine's primary caregiver during the day while William managed his royal duties and the children attended school. The responsibility felt both natural and overwhelming. Michael drove while Carole mentally prepared for this new phase. She had already spoken to the family housekeeper about meal preparations and arranged for additional help with cleaning. The guest room adjacent to the master suite had been prepared as a quiet recovery space where Catherine could rest without feeling disconnected from family activities. When they arrived at the hospital, they found Catherine dressed in her own clothes for the first time in 3 days. She looked fragile but undeniably better, her color improved and her movements less painful. The sight of her daughter in normal clothes rather than hospital garments filled Carole with hope. "I can't wait to sleep in my own bed," Catherine said, embracing her parents carefully. "And to see the children without all these machines beeping around me." The discharge process was more complex than Carole had anticipated. Multiple specialists needed to provide final instructions, prescription medications had to be collected and explained, and follow-up appointments scheduled. Catherine listened intently to everything, taking notes despite her obvious fatigue. William arrived as they were completing the paperwork, having arranged his morning schedule to be present for this transition. His relief was evident as he saw Catherine fully dressed and preparing to leave. The past 3 days had aged him visibly, the strain of managing family concerns while maintaining his public responsibilities clearly taking its toll. The journey home was careful and slow, with Michael taking every curve gently and avoiding any sudden movements that might cause Catherine discomfort. She dozed against the window, exhausted by the simple effort of getting dressed and walking to the car. Recovery, they were learning, was not a straight line of improvement but a series of small steps forward with occasional pauses. Arriving at Adelaide Cottage felt like a celebration despite Catherine's obvious fatigue. The familiar surroundings seemed to energize her slightly, and she insisted on walking through each room to reassure herself that everything was as she had left it. Carole followed closely, ready to provide support if needed, watching for signs that Catherine might be pushing herself too hard. The children's rooms were exactly as they had been maintained during her absence, but seeing them empty during school hours brought tears to Catherine's eyes. "I miss so many bedtime stories," she said quietly, touching a book left open on George's nightstand. "And you'll read so many more," Carole reminded her gently. "This is just a pause, not an ending." They settled Catherine in the prepared recovery room, which offered peace while keeping her connected to household activities. The afternoon sun streamed through windows overlooking the garden, and Carole had arranged fresh flowers from her own garden on the bedside table. These small touches seemed to lift Catherine's spirits considerably. The arrival of the children from school was the moment everyone had been waiting for. George burst through the door first, his usual exuberant energy temporarily subdued by uncertainty about how to approach his recovering mother. Charlotte followed more cautiously, carrying a handmade card and flowers picked from the school garden. Louis toddled in last, too young to understand why everyone seemed so careful around Mama. Catherine's face transformed when she saw them. Despite her exhaustion and lingering pain, she became fully present for her children in a way that reminded Carole powerfully of her own experiences with motherhood. No matter how difficult the circumstances, a mother's love seemed to create its own energy source. "Come here, my darlings," Catherine said, patting the bed beside her. "I've missed you so much." The reunion was tender and careful, with the older children clearly instructed about being gentle with their mother. George showed her drawings he had made during her absence, while Charlotte presented the card with a ceremony befitting a state occasion. Louis simply snuggled close, content to have his mother nearby again. Carole watched this family moment with deep satisfaction. This was what the hospital stay had been leading toward, not just Catherine's physical recovery, but the restoration of her place in the daily rhythms of family life. The children's natural acceptance of their mother's current limitations was both heartbreaking and inspiring. William joined them for an early dinner. The whole family gathered around the kitchen table for the first time in days. Catherine ate more than she had at the hospital, encouraged by the familiar surroundings and her children's chatter about school activities and playground adventures. "Tell me everything," Catherine said to George as he described his latest school project. "I want to hear about every day I missed." George launched into detailed accounts of playground politics, classroom activities, and the substitute teacher who had covered his regular teacher's absence. These ordinary details of childhood seemed to nourish Catherine in ways that medical care could not, reconnecting her to the normal world she had temporarily left behind. As evening approached and the children prepared for bed, the real test of Catherine's homecoming began. Bedtime routines had always been sacred in their household, a time for stories, quiet conversation, and the comfort of parental presence. But Catherine's energy was clearly waning, and the question of how to manage these precious moments with her current limitations loomed large. "I can read tonight," William offered, but both George and Charlotte clearly wanted their mother to resume her traditional role. "What if we all read together?" Carole suggested. "Mama can choose the story, and we can take turns reading pages. That way everyone gets to participate without anyone getting too tired." This compromise worked beautifully. They gathered in George's room, the whole family crowded onto his bed while Catherine chose a favorite story from her own childhood. Each person read a page, with Louis providing enthusiastic commentary despite not yet reading himself. The shared experience felt both familiar and new, adapted to current circumstances but maintaining the essential warmth of family connection. After the children were settled in their beds, Catherine's exhaustion became apparent. The emotional energy required for homecoming and reunion had depleted her reserves more than any physical activity. Carole helped her prepare for bed, a role reversal that felt both strange and natural. "Thank you for everything," Catherine said as Carole helped her arrange pillows for comfort. "I don't know how I would have managed any of this without you." "You don't have to manage alone," Carole replied. "That's what families are for. We take care of each other." The next few days established new routines adapted to Catherine's recovery needs. Mornings began slowly, with Catherine resting while the children prepared for school. Carole arrived each day after Michael's departure for work, ready to provide whatever support was needed. These quiet hours together became precious for both mother and daughter. Without the distractions of hospital staff or scheduled procedures, they could simply talk. Catherine shared her fears about recovery, her frustration with physical limitations, her guilt about disrupting everyone's normal routines. "I keep thinking I should be further along by now," Catherine admitted during one of these morning conversations. The doctors say I'm recovering well, but I feel so weak sometimes. Carole remembered her own experiences with recovery from various ailments over the years. Healing isn't just physical, she reminded Catherine. Your body went through something traumatic. It's going to take time for everything to feel normal again. The afternoons brought different challenges as Catherine tried to resume limited participation in family activities. She wanted to help with homework, prepare snacks, maintain some involvement in the children's daily lives. But her energy remained unpredictable, forcing constant adjustments to plans and expectations. One afternoon, Charlotte came home upset about a playground conflict with friends. Catherine's instinct was to gather her daughter close for their usual heart-to-heart conversation, but sitting up for extended periods remained difficult. Instead, they lay together on Catherine's bed while Charlotte poured out her troubles. Sometimes being different from other children is hard, Catherine told her daughter, thinking about how their own family's unique circumstances had shaped their children's experiences. But it also teaches you to be kind to people who might feel left out or misunderstood. These adapted moments of parenting required creativity but often proved more intimate than their previous versions. Catherine's temporary limitations forced her to focus entirely on emotional presence rather than bustling activity, creating space for deeper connection with her children. Carole observed these interactions with growing admiration for her daughter's adaptability. Catherine was learning to be a mother in new ways, finding alternative methods to provide the love and guidance her children needed. This flexibility in the face of challenge reminded Carole of Catherine's childhood resilience, the same quality that had helped her navigate the complexities of royal life. The evenings brought William's return from his royal duties, and the family's attempt to establish new patterns that accommodated Catherine's needs while maintaining some normalcy for the children. Dinner preparations became group efforts, with everyone contributing according to their abilities. George appointed himself his mother's special assistant, bringing her anything she needed and proudly reporting on his helpfulness to anyone who would listen. Charlotte took over certain household responsibilities with the serious dedication she brought to all her tasks. Even Louis seemed to understand that Mama needed extra gentleness, approaching her with unusual care for a toddler. These adjustments in family dynamics revealed new strengths in each family member. The children were learning compassion and responsibility in ways that no lesson could teach. William was discovering reserves of domestic capability he hadn't known he possessed. Catherine was finding that accepting help didn't diminish her role as mother but rather demonstrated trust in her family's love. One evening, as they sat together watching the children play in the garden, Catherine reflected on the unexpected gifts of this difficult experience. I was so focused on what I couldn't do, she said to Carole. I didn't realize how much closer we would all become by having to depend on each other differently. Carole understood exactly what her daughter meant. Crisis had a way of stripping away non-essentials and revealing what truly mattered. The family's love for each other had been tested and proven stronger than any temporary setback. As the first week at home drew to a close, Catherine's energy was noticeably improving. She could stay awake for longer periods, move around more comfortably, and participate more actively in family routines. The frightening vulnerability of the hospital stay was gradually giving way to cautious optimism about full recovery. But, perhaps more important than physical improvement was the emotional growth that had occurred for everyone involved. They had learned that strength could coexist with vulnerability, that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom, and that love expressed through caregiving created bonds that were deeper than those formed during easier times. The journey was far from over, but they were no longer simply enduring it. They were learning from it, growing through it, and discovering that even difficult experiences could become sources of gratitude when faced together with courage and love. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine's return home, and the spring morning that greeted Carole as she drove to Adelaide Cottage felt like a promise. The countryside was alive with new growth, daffodils nodding in the breeze and trees beginning to show their first tender leaves. The symbolic timing wasn't lost on her, renewal and recovery seemed to be happening everywhere she looked. Catherine met her at the door, walking without the careful, measured steps that had characterized her movement in previous weeks. Her color was good, her energy clearly improved, and, most importantly, the worry lines that had creased her forehead were beginning to fade. She looked like herself again, though perhaps with a new depth of understanding that hadn't been there before her illness. I have wonderful news, Catherine said, embracing her mother with strength that had been absent for weeks. The surgeon called yesterday. Everything looks perfect. I'm cleared for normal activities, and the follow-up appointments can be spaced much further apart now. Carole felt tears spring to her eyes, But these were different from the tears that had overwhelmed her at the hospital. These were tears of pure relief and joy, the kind that come when a long-held breath can finally be released. Her daughter was truly going to be all right. The morning was spent in comfortable activity rather than the careful rest that had dominated recent weeks. Catherine moved around her kitchen with growing confidence, preparing lunch for the family and chatting about plans that extended beyond the immediate concerns of recovery. She spoke about upcoming school events for the children, royal engagements she was eager to resume, and personal projects that had been set aside during her illness. "I want to do something special for everyone who helped us through this," Catherine said, making lists with the organized efficiency Carole remembered from her daughter's childhood. "The hospital staff, the family, the people who covered my duties. I've been thinking about it for weeks." This forward-looking planning was perhaps the clearest sign of Catherine's emotional recovery. For weeks, her focus had necessarily been limited to the immediate challenges of healing. Now she was thinking beyond herself again, considering how to express gratitude and re-engage with the wider world that had supported her family during their difficult time. The children's return from school that afternoon provided another measure of how much had changed. Instead of approaching their mother with the careful concern that had characterized recent weeks, they burst through the door with typical childhood energy, immediately involving her in their daily dramas and excitement. Catherine kept up with their enthusiasm easily, no longer needing to conserve energy for basic activities. George had been selected for his school's cricket team, news he had been saving to share properly with his mother when she was feeling well enough to be appropriately excited. Charlotte had completed a project about family heritage that she wanted to present in detail. Louis had learned a new song at nursery school that he performed with theatrical enthusiasm. Watching Catherine engage fully with each child's news, Carole reflected on how illness had temporarily simplified their lives in ways that were both difficult and surprisingly valuable. The busy schedule of activities and obligations that normally filled their days had been stripped away, leaving only the essential interactions that truly mattered. Now that health was returning, they seemed determined to maintain some of that focus on what was most important. "I don't want to go back to being too busy to really listen," Catherine said later, as they watched the children play in the garden. "Being sick taught me how precious ordinary moments are. I don't want to forget that lesson." William arrived home early that evening, another sign that the crisis phase of Catherine's recovery had passed. For weeks, he had scheduled his days around her needs, always leaving time for unexpected medical appointments or simply to provide support during difficult hours. His return to a more normal routine indicated their shared confidence in Catherine's improved health. Dinner conversation that night was lively and wide-ranging, touching on school activities, work projects, and plans for the approaching Easter holiday. For the first time in weeks, medical concerns weren't the underlying current beneath all other topics. Catherine participated fully, even staying up past her recent early bedtime without showing signs of exhaustion. "We should plan something special for Easter," Catherine suggested. "Nothing too elaborate, but something that celebrates being together and being grateful for good health." The discussion that followed was filled with ideas and enthusiasm. George wanted an Easter egg hunt that would challenge his improved athletic skills. Charlotte proposed a family art project that everyone could contribute to over the holiday weekend. Louis requested extra time with the family pets and perhaps a picnic if the weather cooperated. These normal family planning conversations felt precious after weeks of uncertainty. The ability to look ahead with confidence, to make plans that assumed continued good health, represented a return to the natural optimism that had been temporarily set aside during the crisis. Later that evening, after the children had been settled for bed, Catherine and Carole sat together in the garden room watching the last light fade from the spring sky. The comfortable quiet between them was filled with unspoken understanding of how much they had all been through together. "I've been thinking about that first day at the hospital," Catherine said eventually. "About how you cried when you saw me. I was so worried about being strong for everyone else that I hadn't given myself permission to acknowledge how scared I was. Your tears gave me permission to be honest about my own fears." Carole nodded, remembering the overwhelming emotions of that morning. "I was so worried about falling apart when you needed me to be strong. But maybe falling apart was exactly what you needed to see." "It was," Catherine agreed. "It reminded me that being strong doesn't mean pretending nothing is wrong. It means facing what's wrong honestly and dealing with it together." This insight seemed to capture something important about their family's experience during the past month. They had all learned new ways to support each other, discovered strengths they didn't know they possessed, and found that vulnerability could be a source of connection rather than weakness. The conversation turned to practical matters as Catherine began to consider her return to public duties. The royal schedule had been managed carefully during her absence, with other family members covering her engagements and several events postponed to allow for her recovery. Now decisions needed to be made about when and how to resume her normal responsibilities. "I want to start slowly," Catherine said. "A few small engagements at first, things that don't require travel or long hours. I need to prove to myself that I can handle the pressures before taking on anything major." This cautious approach reflected hard-won wisdom about the importance of pacing recovery rather than rushing back to full activity too quickly. Catherine had learned to listen to her body's signals and respect its need for continued healing even when her energy felt normal again. Over the following days, the transition back to normal life continued gradually. Catherine began taking on more household responsibilities, spending longer periods actively engaged with the children's activities, and participating in planning discussions about future royal engagements. Each step forward was measured and deliberate, building confidence without risking setback. Carole's daily visits became less about providing care and more about enjoying restored normalcy. They could focus on regular family concerns rather than medical needs, discuss future plans rather than immediate challenges, and simply enjoy each other's company without the underlying anxiety that had colored recent weeks. One morning, Catherine insisted on driving herself to a medical appointment for the first time since her surgery. This simple act of independence felt monumental to everyone involved. Carole followed in her own car, ready to provide support if needed, but Catherine managed the entire outing confidently and returned home energized rather than exhausted. "I feel like myself again," Catherine announced that afternoon, and Carole could see the truth of this statement in her daughter's posture, energy, and engagement with everything around her. The children seemed to sense this restoration of their mother's normal capabilities. Their careful concern of recent weeks gave way to typical childhood demands for attention, assistance, and involvement in their various activities. Catherine met these demands with patience and enthusiasm that had been impossible during her recovery but now seemed effortless again. Easter weekend arrived with perfect spring weather and a family celebration that felt especially meaningful given recent events. The children's Easter egg hunt was elaborate and competitive, with Catherine participating as enthusiastically as anyone. The family art project resulted in a large canvas covered with handprints, drawings, and messages of love and gratitude. Most importantly, the holiday felt natural rather than forced. There was no sense of trying to prove that everything was back to normal, no overcompensation for the difficult weeks behind them. Instead, there was simply a family enjoying time together with deeper appreciation for the gift of good health and mutual support. On Easter Sunday evening, as they cleaned up after a day of celebration, Catherine pulled Carole aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know how much your support meant during the worst of this," she said. "Not just the practical help, but the emotional honesty. You showed me that it was okay to be scared, okay to need help, okay to not have everything under control all the time." Carole felt the truth of her daughter's words settle into her heart. "We all learned something important," she replied. "About love, about strength, about what really matters when everything else is stripped away." As she drove home that evening, Carole reflected on the journey her family had completed together. The tears she had shed at Catherine's bedside now seemed like exactly the right response to an impossible situation. The vulnerability they had all shown had strengthened rather than weakened their bonds with each other. Catherine's illness had been frightening and disruptive, but it had also been illuminating. It had revealed the depth of their love for each other, the strength of their family foundation, and their capacity to adapt and support each other through whatever challenges might arise. Most importantly, it had taught them that being human meant accepting both strength and weakness, celebrating health while acknowledging fragility, and finding in their shared vulnerability a source of deeper connection and understanding. The tears Carole had cried that first morning at the hospital had been the beginning of a healing process that extended far beyond physical recovery to encompass emotional growth and strengthen family bonds. Now, as spring blossomed around them and normal life resumed its gentle rhythms, they carried with them the lessons learned during their most difficult weeks together. They had faced crisis with love and emerged not just intact, but closer and stronger than before. The memory of those tears would always remind them of how much they meant to each other, and how precious their life together truly was.